What would you do if an ordinary school day suddenly turned into a fight for survival? Imagine sitting in your classroom, counting the minutes until dismissal, when suddenly the air changes. A strange smell, a faint trace of smoke. At first, it feels like nothing, but within moments, everything spirals out of control. This is not just a story about a fire. It's a story about loss, courage, and the fragile line between life and death. And for those who lived through it, it's something they never truly left behind. In the late 1950s, life in Chicago was thriving. The city was alive with industry, culture, and growing communities. Neighborhoods were tightly connected, and for many families, identity wasn't just about where you lived, it was about where you belonged. And for thousands of families on the West Side, that sense of belonging centered around one place, a parish called Our Lady of the Angels. This wasn't just a church, it was the heart of the community. Families lived just blocks away. Children walked to school together. Neighbors knew each other by name. Sundays meant packed church services, followed by long family meals filled with laughter, tradition, and warmth. For many immigrant families, especially those from Italy, this parish felt like home in a new world. Kids played freely in the streets. Parents worked hard in factories and small businesses. Life was simple, structured, and deeply rooted in faith. Inside the parish stood a school filled with energy, hundreds of children, classrooms buzzing with chatter, and teachers dedicated to shaping young lives. But like many schools of that era, it was overcrowded. Classrooms often held dozens of students, sometimes so many that children had to take turns sitting. Discipline was strict, and the teachers, many of them nuns, were firm but deeply committed. To the children, this was normal life, routine, predictable, safe. At least it seemed that way. The building itself looked solid from the outside. Red brick walls, tall windows, and the kind of structure people trusted without question. But inside, it told a different story. Much of the interior was made of wood. Floors, doors, stairways, all polished to shine. Beautiful, yes, but also dangerously flammable. At the time, newer safety standards existed: fire alarms, sprinkler systems, enclosed stairwells, but many older buildings were not required to adopt them, and this school was one of them. Despite regular fire drills that gave everyone a sense of preparedness, the reality was far more fragile than anyone realized. Everything appeared under control, until the day it wasn't. It was a cold but sunny Monday, December 1st, 1958. For the children, it was just another school day. In fact, it felt special. December had arrived, and with it came the excitement of Christmas. The countdown had begun. Inside classrooms, students glanced at the clock, waiting for the final bell. Teachers continued their lessons. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, something subtle changed. A faint wisp of smoke. At first, it barely caught attention. A student noticed it creeping under a classroom door. Confusion replaced routine. A teacher moved to investigate. And the moment that door opened, everything changed. A wave of thick black smoke burst into the room, fast, violent, and suffocating. Within seconds, visibility dropped. The air turned toxic. Breathing became difficult. Panic began to spread. Students coughed, gasped, and looked for a way out. Some froze in fear. Others rushed toward windows. Desks were pushed aside. Chaos replaced order. What had started as a normal school day was now a race against time. What no one inside knew yet was this: a fire had already been burning in the basement for nearly 20 minutes, hidden, growing, feeding on the building itself. By the time smoke reached the upper floors, it was no longer a small incident. It was a full-scale disaster. The fire moved quickly, climbing through stairways like a living force. With no proper barriers to stop it, It spread with terrifying speed, hallways filled with heat and toxic gases. Escape routes that students had practiced using during drills were suddenly blocked. They were trapped. Some children made desperate decisions: jump or stay, wait for help, or try to escape on their own. In those moments, survival came down to instinct. Some climbed onto window ledges, looking down at the ground far below. Others hesitated, paralyzed by fear. Some held onto hope that rescue would arrive in time. Teachers tried to maintain order, urging students to stay calm. But fear was stronger, and time was running out. Miles away, firefighters received the call. For them, it was just another emergency, until they heard the address. Many of them knew the place. Some had gone to school there themselves. Their own families had walked those halls. This wasn't just a fire. This was personal. As engines roared toward the scene, no one yet understood the scale of what was unfolding. But within minutes, they would. And what they would find would stay with them forever. By the time the fire revealed itself, it was already too late. What began as a small hidden flame in the basement had transformed into something far more dangerous. Something alive, fast-moving, and uncontrollable. It had spent nearly 20 minutes growing in silence, feeding on paper, wood, and air. And now it had found its way upward. Inside the upper floor classrooms, the situation turned critical within moments. Smoke didn't just enter, it attacked. It poured through doorways and hallways, thick and black, swallowing light and replacing breathable air with something suffocating and toxic. Students who moments ago were laughing and waiting for the bell were now coughing, choking, and struggling to stay calm. The heat followed quickly. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unbearable. Children described it later as feeling like the air itself was burning. Teachers tried to act fast. Some attempted to guide students toward the hallways, following the same evacuation routes they had practiced during drills. But those routes, those carefully rehearsed paths to safety, were no longer usable. The hallways were already filled with smoke and heat. The stairways had become deadly, and the fire, moving rapidly through the building's wooden interior, had cut off escape. What had once been a structured plan now collapsed into confusion. There was no clear way out. In classroom after classroom, the same realization began to set in. They were trapped. Some students rushed toward the windows. Fresh air, if they could reach it, offered the only chance of survival. But even that came with a terrifying choice. From the upper floors, the ground looked impossibly far away. Jumping meant risking serious injury, or worse. But staying inside meant facing smoke, fire, and suffocation. For many, it wasn't a choice at all. It was instinct. In one room, children began climbing onto desks, pushing past one another in desperation to reach the windows. Some cried out for help. Others froze completely, unable to process what was happening. A few sat still at their desks, paralyzed by fear. The chaos was overwhelming. Noise filled the air, shouting, coughing, breaking glass. And underneath it all, the growing roar of the fire. Some teachers tried to maintain order, urging students to stay calm, to wait, to trust that help would arrive. Others quickly realized that waiting might not be an option. Seconds mattered. Every decision mattered. At the windows, the scene became even more intense. Children leaned out, gasping for air, calling for help. Some hesitated, gripping the edges, unable to commit to the jump. Others, driven by fear and urgency, made the leap. Some landed hard. Some were injured. Some were caught by rescuers who were just beginning to arrive below. But not everyone made it out in time. Outside, the first signs of disaster were becoming visible. Smoke poured from the building, rising into the sky in thick, dark clouds. People in the neighborhood stopped, stared, and began to gather. Parents who had come to pick up their children stood frozen, watching as the situation unfolded in front of them. At first, Many didn't understand how serious it was. Then they saw the children at the windows, and everything changed. Firefighters arrived quickly, but what they encountered was beyond anything they had expected. Flames were already consuming large sections of the building. Smoke was pouring out at an alarming rate, and above them, children were trapped, calling out, waiting. Ladders were raised immediately. Rescue attempts began without hesitation. Firefighters climbed upward, pushing through heat and smoke, risking their own lives to reach as many students as possible. Some managed to pull children from windows. Others tried to enter the building, battling flames that seemed to fight back at every step. Time was working against them. Inside, conditions continued to deteriorate. The smoke grew thicker, darker, and more toxic. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Breathing became nearly impossible. Some students collapsed where they stood. Others clung to whatever hope they could find. In certain classrooms, children instinctively gathered together, holding on to one another, seeking comfort in the middle of chaos. Then came a sound that would haunt many for the rest of their lives. A deep, cracking rumble. The structure, weakened by fire, began to give way. Parts of the roof started to collapse, and with it, any remaining hope for those still trapped inside those sections. Outside, the reaction was immediate. Screams, panic, helplessness. Parents watched in horror, unable to reach their children. Firefighters pushed harder, faster, refusing to give up despite the overwhelming conditions. But even their bravery had limits against a fire this powerful. In some rooms, rescue came just in time. A door forced open, a ladder finally reaching a window, a firefighter's hand pulling a child to safety. Moments that meant the difference between life and death. In others, it came too late. As the fire continued to rage, it became clear that this was no longer just an emergency. It was a catastrophe, one that would leave an entire community shattered, one that would be remembered for generations. And as the flames slowly began to come under control, a painful question started to emerge. How could something like this happen? And more importantly, could it have been prevented? When the flames finally began to die down, a heavy silence took their place. It wasn't the kind of silence that brings relief. It was the kind that follows devastation. Outside the school, chaos had turned into heartbreak. Firefighters, exhausted and shaken, continued moving through the building, searching, hoping, dreading what they might find. The smoke still lingered, thick and bitter, clinging to everything it touched. Parents crowded the streets. Some were crying. Some were calling out names. Some stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. And others were desperately waiting for answers. Ambulances arrived one after another. The injured were rushed to nearby hospitals. Children with burns, broken bones, and severe smoke inhalation. Many were in shock. Some were unable to even speak their own names. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, doing everything they could to save lives. Hospital corridors filled quickly. So did the waiting rooms. Parents searched from one hospital to another, hoping to find their children among the survivors. For some, that hope was answered. For many others, it was not. As the hours passed, a darker reality began to emerge. Families who couldn't find their children in hospitals were directed somewhere no parent should ever have to go: the morgue. Inside, the atmosphere was unbearable. Rows of small bodies covered, identities waiting to be confirmed. Parents walked in, one by one, facing the unimaginable. The moment of recognition. The moment everything changes forever. No words could ease that pain. No explanation could make sense of it. By the end of the tragedy, the numbers were devastating. 92 children, 3 teachers, gone. An entire community, torn apart in a single afternoon. In the days that followed, grief spread across the city. In Chicago, it felt as though every neighborhood had been touched by loss. Streets that once echoed with children's laughter now felt quiet, heavy, incomplete. It was said that nearly every block had lost a child, sometimes more than one. Funerals began almost immediately. Churches filled with mourners, families, friends, neighbors, strangers, people united by grief. Rows of small coffins lined the spaces. The scale of the loss was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a collective wound. Schools across the city paused. Communities came together. And yet, even in the presence of support, many struggled to understand what had happened. Why did this happen? Could it have been stopped? Who was responsible? These questions echoed everywhere, in homes, in churches, in city offices, and in the hearts of those who had survived. For survivors, the physical wounds were only part of the story. Burns healed, bones recovered, but the emotional scars remained. Some children couldn't sleep without reliving the moment, the smoke, the heat, the fear. Others became afraid of enclosed spaces. Some couldn't return to school without anxiety overwhelming them, and many carried something even heavier, survivor's guilt. Why did I make it out when others didn't? It was a question that followed them for years, for decades, sometimes for a lifetime. At that time, psychological support was not what it is today. There were no structured counseling programs, no trauma specialists guiding children through their experiences. Instead, many were told to move on, to stay strong, to not talk about it. But silence doesn't erase pain. It buries it. And for many survivors, that buried pain would resurface again and again. Even the adults, teachers, firefighters, priests, were deeply affected. Many of the firefighters who responded that day had seen war. But they would later say that nothing prepared them for what they witnessed inside that school. The images stayed with them. The sounds stayed with them. And the memories never left. As grief filled the city, attention began to shift toward understanding what went wrong. Investigations were launched. Officials examined the building, the structure, the fire's origin. Every detail mattered, because behind the grief, there was a growing need for accountability. Early findings revealed a troubling truth. The building, though common for its time, lacked critical safety features. No modern fire alarm system connected to emergency services. No sprinkler system. Stairways that allowed fire and smoke to spread quickly instead of containing it. Fire extinguishers that were difficult to access. And perhaps most concerning of all, regulations that allowed older buildings to operate without updating to newer safety standards. In simple terms, the building was not prepared for a fire of this magnitude. And when the fire came, it had nothing to stop it. Speculation about the cause also began to circulate. Was it an accident? Was it carelessness? Or was it something more deliberate? At one point, investigators explored the possibility of arson. Questions were asked. Witnesses were interviewed. Even a young suspect emerged years later with a troubling confession. But in the end, no definitive conclusion was ever reached. The official cause of the fire remained undetermined. For many families, that uncertainty only deepened the pain. Because without answers, there was no closure. Lawsuits followed. Settlements were made. Funds were created to support victims and families. But as many parents would later say, no amount of money could ever replace what was lost. Yet, from this tragedy, something began to change. Slowly, reluctantly, but significantly. People began to realize that this wasn't just a single incident. It was a warning about outdated buildings, a warning about overlooked safety measures, a warning that, if ignored, could lead to more tragedies. And so, out of grief, came a demand for change. In the wake of unimaginable loss, one question refused to fade. What now? For the families, the survivors, and the entire community, life would never return to what it once was. The laughter that once filled the neighborhood had been replaced by silence. The routines that once felt comforting now carried painful reminders. But even in the deepest grief, something began to shift. The tragedy had exposed a harsh reality, one that could no longer be ignored. Schools across the country, not just in Chicago, were vulnerable. Many buildings shared the same risks: outdated construction, flammable materials, lack of proper fire alarms, no sprinkler systems, and emergency plans that worked in theory, but failed under real conditions. This time, the warning was too devastating to overlook. Public pressure grew rapidly. Parents demanded answers, communities demanded accountability, and officials were forced to act. Investigations and reports highlighted what many had feared. The disaster wasn't just the result of a fire. It was the result of unpreparedness, a system that had allowed safety to fall behind. In response, sweeping changes began to take place. Fire safety codes were rewritten, not just locally, but across the United States. New requirements were introduced for schools. Modern fire alarm systems connected directly to emergency services. Mandatory sprinkler systems. Fire-resistant building materials. Clearly marked and accessible exits. Regular and more realistic emergency drills. These weren't small adjustments. They were life-saving transformations. And the impact was profound. In the years that followed, countless potential disasters were prevented. Not because fires stopped happening, but because buildings were finally equipped to handle them. Lives that might have been lost were saved. In a painful way, the tragedy became a turning point. A moment that forced change. A moment that made future generations safer. But while laws and buildings improved, healing the human side of the tragedy was far more complicated. For the survivors, moving forward was not a straight path. Some found ways to rebuild their lives, carrying their experiences as a source of strength. Others struggled silently, haunted by memories that refused to fade. Many chose careers rooted in service, becoming firefighters, nurses, police officers, or community workers. It was as if, in surviving, they felt a responsibility to give back, to protect others, to make their lives meaningful in the face of what they had witnessed. Still, the emotional weight remained. For some, even decades later, certain triggers, like the smell of smoke or the sound of sirens, could bring everything rushing back. Not as memories, but as moments relived. And then there were the families who had lost children. For them, time didn't heal. It simply moved forward. Birthdays became reminders. Holidays carried absence, and the question of what could have been lingered in quiet moments. The neighborhood itself changed too. What was once a tightly connected community slowly began to shift. Some families moved away, unable to remain in a place filled with painful memories. Others stayed, but carried the weight of what had happened in every street, every corner, every familiar face that was no longer there. The identity of the parish evolved, but it never forgot. Years later, the site of the tragedy was rebuilt. A new structure rose, stronger, safer, designed with the lessons of the past in mind. It stood not just as a building, but as a symbol of resilience, of remembrance, of change. Memorials were created to honor those who had been lost. Names were engraved. Stories were preserved, and every year people gathered to remember, not just how they died, but who they were. Children with dreams, teachers with purpose, lives full of potential. For many survivors, these gatherings became a source of connection, a way to share memories, a way to heal together, because no one else could fully understand what they had been through. Over time, something powerful emerged from the tragedy, a sense of unity, a bond formed not just through loss, but through survival. Some survivors even found unexpected paths in life, relationships, careers, and purpose shaped by that single day. They carried the memory with them, not just as pain, but as motivation, to live fully, to help others, to make their lives count. And perhaps that is the most important part of this story. Yes, it is a story of tragedy. Yes, it is a story of loss. But it is also a story of transformation. Because from one of the darkest days came awareness. From awareness came change. And from change came protection for millions of lives. Today, school safety standards exist the way they do because of lessons learned through moments like this. Because of lives that were lost. Because of a community that refused to let those lives be forgotten. And while the pain of that day will never fully disappear, its legacy continues in something meaningful. Every safe school, every functioning fire alarm, every child who walks out of a building unharmed. This story reminds us of something we often take for granted. Safety is not automatic. It is built. It is improved. And sometimes, it is written in the cost of human lives. So as we remember this tragedy, we don't just remember what happened. We remember why it matters. Because behind every rule, every system, every precaution, there is a story. And this is one that should never be forgotten.